Good morning and good evening and good afternoon, everyone. I am Julia Chan Block and would like to welcome everyone to today's report launch, which is the culmination of a year-long initiative co-sponsored by the U.S.-China Education Trust and the Peking University Institute for Global Cooperation and Understanding. This four-part webinar series, Trilateral Perspectives on Indo-Pacific Strategic Cooperation, addressed in closed-door discussions a critical range of challenging topics relevant to the three largest stakeholders in the Indo-Pacific, the US, China, and India. The topics discussed included global and regional order, maritime security, geoeconomics of Asia, and understanding and managing strategic mistrust. The series brought together speakers of the highest caliber from each of the three countries to engage in an open and candid exchange of views. They included 8 ambassadors, 3 former military leaders, multiple former foreign secretaries and government ministers, think tankers, and scholars. You're sure to recognize some of the names in the appendix section of the report, and I am truly, truly thankful for their time, thoughtful participation, and support for the series. These discussions also included a select group of dedicated audience participants, comprising sitting government officials, diplomats, thought leaders, and other foreign policy experts, as well as selected graduate students and young scholars who contributed their diverse perspectives during the moderated discussion portion of each session. I thank everyone who participated. Amidst the global turmoil driven by the COVID-19 pandemic and increasing challenges confronting the US-China and China-India bilateral relationships, the conclusions and recommendations from this series are important and timely. They underscore the growing recognition that no region will be more important to future global peace and prosperity than the Indo-Pacific, whose oceans are now the world's busiest and most strategically significant trade route, carrying 2/3 of the world's oil and half of its containers. The region also has more geopolitical hotspots, border disputes, competing maritime claims, and political and economic rivalries. While mounting tensions among the three stakeholders have brought official dialogue to a standoff, I remain a firm advocate of the power of track 2 style dialogues, like the trilateral perspectives discussions, to to mitigate strategic miscalculations and build mutual understanding. Despite significant disagreements among the speakers in the Trilateral Perspective series on certain issues, they were still able to find areas of agreement and ways to cooperate. I suggest that everyone listens carefully when Ambassador Schaefer presents highlights from the report, which lays out quite clearly where the three countries can work together. And there is unanimity of agreement on one very sobering point. Speakers from all three countries expressed fear that the greatest danger in the Indo-Pacific may be the unthinkable, the possibility of flashpoints leading to war. To prevent the unthinkable, I hope this report launch is not the end of the Trilateral series, but rather the catalyst for turning some of the recommendations into action. To ensure ample time for discussion today, let me stop here and thank Ambassador Teresita Schaefer, USAID's special advisor for this series and the report's author. It was truly a privilege, Tessie, to work with you. and USET is grateful for the extraordinary range of knowledge and expertise you brought to this initiative to guide us from inception to successful conclusion. Before I turn the floor over to Ambassador Schaefer, I recommend you download the report from USET's website if you have not already done so. The link to the report is in chat. Just press the chat button and you'll have it. Thank you all. Ambassador Schaefer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Block. And I'm delighted that so many people have joined us to launch the report on US, Chinese, and Indian perspectives in the Indo-Pacific region. This project, as Ambassador Block just said, is a byproduct of several decades of accelerating change and a shorter period of more intense disruption that had a disproportionate effect on this region. The clashes between India and China near Galwan in the summer of 2020, which caused the first fatalities in action in 45 years, was an uncomfortable reminder that hot crises still occur in the region. At root, our four webinars were trying to probe the strategic mistrust, which has become ever more evident. Ambassador Block cataloged the aspects of the region that we looked at, but the recommendations that conclude this report and that will conclude my presentation are focused on this central goal of preventing and managing strategic mistrust. So let me start with the global and regional order, which was the subject of our first webinar. This session looked at two themes that recurred throughout the series: the question of regional norms and their adjustment, about which the three countries have different perspectives, and the importance for the United States and India of dealing with China's growing power. The Indo-Pacific region does not have a single region-wide institution. Governance and regional consultations certainly take place and rely on a combination of informal unwritten norms and trade and other rules set by global institutions. China regards reform of these norms as a reasonable ambition. India at present is more concerned with practical issues affecting their trade flows through the area. And the United States is comfortable with the present norms. A speaker from India argued that the three key drivers for the next few years would be how China uses its expanded power, how the United States responds, and India's openness to engaging with both. The second webinar dealt with maritime security, which we selected as one of the sectors for closer examination because all three countries we are talking about are highly dependent on seaborne trade. And this area is increasingly important. The seas in this area are increasingly important to all of their security picture. The discussion in this webinar focused on the maritime interests of all three countries and potential areas for cooperation. There was a widely shared view that the two areas that most lent themselves to cooperation were climate change and economic collaboration. There was a brief and inconclusive discussion of norms and standards for transit through each other's waters. But the most intense discussion dealt with the danger of unintended clashes and how these might be avoided or de-escalated. These ideas figured importantly in the recommendations, which I will address in a few minutes. The third webinar dealt with geoeconomics, and it started off with a striking discussion of how dramatically patterns of economic production have changed in the world. In the past 2 decades, the combined gross domestic product of the G7 countries has fallen from 44% to 25 to 30% of global output. In these same 20 years, the BRICS countries, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, their combined GDP rose from under 20% of the global total to almost 35%, a larger percentage, interestingly enough, than the G7. This change started well before the pandemic. With the pandemic, however, many countries turned inward, including all three covered in this report. This accentuated some of the economic dislocations. Accelerating technological change in such fields as 3D printing and blockchain have shone a light on potential benefits, even as they deepened adjustment problems at the country level in many countries. The global economic institutions, in particular the WTO, are in trouble. One interesting observation was that the US and Indian speakers were both quite critical of their own government's policies, which they found too protectionist. Two speakers responding to a question about from the other participants about economic self-reliance urged that this not be conflated with import controls. Diversifying supply chains rather than simply bringing home production could produce a much more economically beneficial result. Economic competition is certainly a factor in the relations of these three countries. Nonetheless, unlike maritime security, the discussion of economics seemed to reflect at least an implicit sense that it could produce mutual benefit. Now we come to understanding and managing strategic mistrust, which is the underlying theme throughout the webinar and the specific focus of the fourth webinar. The discussions in the first three sessions came together. The opening speaker cited a classic study by Kenneth Lieberthal and Wang Jixi, which included a useful definition of strategic mistrust. Quote, the mutual distrust of long-term intentions, end quote. Trust, by contrast, existed when, and I'm quoting again, a nation's long-term plans are understood and its actions roughly correspond to those plans, end quote. Strategic mistrust among the United States, China, and India had been a constant, but had not been seen in the past at current levels of intensity. Speakers from all three countries acknowledged that divergent interests were the main reason for mutual suspicions among the three. India felt that China was unhappy with its rise. China felt that the United States did not accept China's rise as a maritime power. The United States believed China wanted to end American primacy in the Indo-Pacific. Put another way, in the words of a US speaker, China sought to recover the centrality it believed it had enjoyed in the past. Other Asian countries wanted to preserve their autonomy, and the United States sought to preserve its primacy within what he termed a robust multipolarity. What was most striking about this discussion, and Ambassador Block has mentioned it, but I will mention it again, was that speakers from all three countries were deeply worried about the possibility of current flashpoints leading to a crisis that could get out of control. The Taiwan issue was a case in point. Avoiding a catastrophic war should be the primary goal for all three countries. And now I come to the recommendations. These fell into three big categories: dialogue, accident prevention, and subject-specific cooperation. First, dialogue. There is substantial experience with successful dialogues among these three countries. And let me again emphasize that successful doesn't mean that they solved all problems, but that they achieved deeper understanding and helped manage problems. These need to take place at top levels and also among senior level and working level officials. As Ambassador Bloch noted, this has been a difficult time for dialogue. Between the United States and India, it is proceeding well on all three levels. US and Chinese leaders have also now met at the summit level, which is encouraging. And India and China have met below that level. All these dialogues could usefully be expanded, ideally with some continuity in the participants who can explore broad security issues and can establish mutual understandings on deterrence, competition and cooperation, guardrails, and ground rules. The second category, accident prevention, is the largest cluster of recommendations, and it focuses heavily on the maritime domain. The first recommendation was to develop informal operating protocols to prevent unintended aircraft threats to military vessels. This type of system was used between the United States and the Soviet Union for many years, in spite of their basically adversarial relationship at the time. Similar deconfliction arrangements for submarines, unmanned weapons, and perhaps spacecraft would be a way of exploring whether this type of system can work in other domains. Third recommendation, clarifying legal interpretations of maritime laws or norms. Experience suggests, through other attempts to do this, that this will be more effective if there is agreement in advance on the legitimacy of the process. Another recommendation is working together on anti-terrorism and anti-piracy. There are systems already in place and working in the Indian Ocean. These could be extended further eastward. Another recommendation is emergency communications. Hotlines would be possible. In this region, the one dyad of countries where they have been tried is India and Pakistan. Unfortunately, between those two countries, they tend to work best when relations are reasonably good, which is not when they are most needed. So that there are some understandings that would have to be put in place for these to be truly effective as well. Finally, codes of conduct. The effort to develop a code of conduct with the ASEAN countries and China has been going on for 25 years. The idea is still a good one, but will only work if all stakeholders are included and everyone accepts the legitimacy of the process. And now I come to subject-specific cooperation. Many of the subjects on this list are global ones, and some have already been cited as a promising area for cooperation. So I start with climate change and the environment. The COP26 conference on environmental change took place after our final webinar on strategic mistrust. All three countries participated, and I would particularly note the statement by Environmental Envoy John Kerry and his Chinese counterpart, which I hope will be an early step down a longer road. Second thought is pandemic prevention. And the key here, I think, would be to sidestep the controversy over the coronavirus origins and to develop and eventually implement those preparations that must be made after a new dangerous organism has been identified. Strengthening economic institutions is another one. The World Trade Organization, as I mentioned, is having a difficult time. agreement on making it work better would be very beneficial. This is a very ambitious effort, however. One of the American speakers pointed out that all three of the countries covered in this report contributed to the current troubles in the World Trade Organization. So that's a sobering thought as well. Finally, humanitarian relief. India and the United States have experience working together. China could, and I think should be included. And with what we've seen of recent bizarre weather patterns, it appears that there will be no shortage of targets for humanitarian relief. The report ends with these recommendations. Let me add that many of them could benefit, in my view, from a similar trilateral consultation process about next steps. Perhaps our speakers will have some further thoughts on this, but for now, let me turn the floor over to the three speakers who have agreed to join us. Ambassador Nirupama Rao, Mike Lampton, and Ambassador Wei Wei.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Schaffer, for your excellent presentation, which the report, which nicely capture, I think, the most important idea, the thrust of the four dialogues we have held over the course of almost like a year. So I think it's a quite a journey already. Thank you so much. Next, it is my honor to invite Ambassador Wei Wei, consultant of the People's Institute of Foreign Affairs, and also formerly Chinese ambassador to Brunei, Singapore, and India, to give his remarks. Ambassador Wei, please.
谢谢王教授。各位来自中国、美国。
Thank you very much, Professor Wang, dear colleagues and friends from China, India, and US. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It is a great honor and pleasure to have this opportunity to discuss with you the issues of the three countries and share with you some of my thinkings. If I look at closely what has been happening in recent years, if we look at the global situation and the situation among three countries, I feel that the world is in an era of dramatic changes. International relations are tense. Especially the pandemic has made things even worse. And in this very messy situation, there has been even more mistrust among countries. There has been a lot of anxiety, suspicion, and worries, and even rival sentiment. I'm not accusing anybody of anything. So, but what I'm saying is that there has been a lot of negative sentiments. These negative sentiments may have been exaggerated, which is done to cover some of the internal problems of each one of the countries. There are a lot of international topics. These international topics have covered a lot of the domestic topics in each one of the countries. So what I'm saying is that all the countries should focus on their internal issues rather than expending or costing too much of their resources for international affairs or diplomacy. There is the possibility of Thucydides' trap. So if we look at these three countries, what are their domestic issues and challenges? Three things I would like to say. First of all, India. In comparison to China, India has an important domestic structural problem. That is the problem of land. That is the biggest problem, domestic problem for India. India has its own culture, tradition, and customs. And when India got its independence from the UK, it didn't do a structural reform of its land ownership. But if we compare China and India, since 1949, China has been doing several rounds of land ownership reform. So the results of the reform is very different from the land issue in India. So I think that land issue has been the biggest obstacle in India's economic and social development. Recently, India introduced India failed to introduce several acts to reform its land. If that problem is not solved, it is very hard for India to achieve its economic development. If we look at China, so in 1949, there was a round of land reform. Now we can see how significant that move was. After that, China quickly established its industrial system. And after the reform and opening up policy was introduced, China focused on its infrastructure construction, and there was economic growth being realized. Without the reform of land ownership, China can hardly achieve those economic development. If there's one thing that China can recommend to India is that India should focus on its domestic problems, especially the land ownership issues, and less attention on border disputes. China is a responsible country. If we look at the US, secondly, a lot of American peoples are now complaining that the US has made a mistake to allow China to join the WTO so that so that China can develop its economy and catch up. But I don't think that is true. I'm sorry, I have to be very candid and honest. The domestic problems in the US is not a result of China's development. So the US has its own economic and social structures and systems. I'm not accusing anybody of anything. The US has a typical capitalist system, and it's looking after economic benefits, and it has to have an extended value chain and extend its production to places where the cost is the lowest. So that's why they are proposing the idea of globalization. So they have extended its value chain, and a lot of the production have been transferred to countries like China and other developing countries where the cost is much lower. So China is only a country that have to accept what is happening as globalization, while the US is the one who is leading globalization. And but as a result of that, China has taken on a rise in its industrial development, the system of its the development of industrial system. While in the US is seeing a lot of domestic problems such as the divergence of or disparity between the rich and poor, and things are even worsened by the pandemic. So it is not fair or objective to accuse China for a lot of the domestic problems in the US. There has been a trade war between China and US. This is not a result of China's effort. Rather, the trade war is a result of the globalization that the US has been promoting. We're talking about decoupling. I don't think there will be complete decoupling between China and US. Maybe there is a half coupling. There will still be some link between China and the US, for example, in science and technology. China and the US are different, but the fundamental cause is that China and the US are having completely different system. Now let's look at China. China has a tremendous ambition, that is to realize the rejuvenation of the Chinese people. This is China's internal driven goal, and China is not talking about competing with anybody or to perform anybody. China is trying to realize its own dreams.
And it doesn't have to do with the so-called bullying, because it is all happening within China's territory. It is about, it is a horizontal, it is a vertical concept, it's a horizontal concept. And it is about self-strengthening of China. It cannot be misunderstood about international as an international subject of bullying others. So the threat theory of China's rejuvenation or China's rise actually is a misunderstanding of Chinese people's mentality. It results from a misunderstanding of the Chinese history, because those who understand China's history would know that China has been feeling that it is the centrality of the world. That's why it is called the Middle Kingdom. And all the revolutions happening within China was about seizing power in the capital, not seeking power outside of China's sovereign territory. The reason why I took the liberty to talk about the domestic issues of the three countries is because I feel that all three countries have their own domestic problems to deal with. That are the important matters concerning each country's well-being, rather than misunderstanding or having misconceptions of other countries. And I don't think we should waste valuable resources on some non-worthy subjects. I want to thank all the panelists and the host and the staff members of the conference. Thank you.
谢谢魏大使. Thank you
Thank you
so
very
much,
much, Ambassador Wei,
for your excellent remarks, particularly looking at the domestic development in all three countries, in China, United States, and India. I'm sure that your remarks will resonate well among the participants and give us a lot of food for thought. Thank you, Ambassador Wei. Next, it is my honor to invite Ambassador Nirupama Mendong Rao, former India Foreign Secretary and also former India Ambassador to China, as well as to the United States. So Ambassador Rao, please.
Thank you so much. And it's an honor to be present here today on the occasion of the release of this very, very important report, which I have read with considerable interest. It's sharply analytical and very thought-provoking, and it offers a number of leads which I believe we should follow when it comes to considering the future of our shared region, the Indo-Pacific region, in which all our three countries have a stake as far as the future is concerned. Reading through the report, I thought I'd highlight a few aspects and a few observations that really struck me, and I will enumerate them briefly. I believe the most important issue that confronts us is the management of strategic mistrust, particularly because, as the report says, the regional situation is so sobering. I think where India and the United States are concerned, as I read the report, there is an indication of dissonance about China and with China, and that's a fundamental one that we need to address. Now, as far as India's difficulties with China are concerned, we realize that the challenges we face are an India-China problem, first and foremost. But where it becomes the concern of the United States also is China's strategic plans and intentions on the Eurasian heartland. Since its raised activity along the borders with India, is not separate as we see it. Please understand, this is the perspective as I speak from India. It's not separate, but a part of the larger chessboard of the Belt and Road Initiative, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and the pushing of its Western horizon into Central Asia and the Central Asian republics, something that Daniel Markey illustrated very well in his recent book, China's Western Horizon. Now, even as the report mentions that security does not lend itself to cooperation, given the levels of strategic mistrust, confidence building, de-escalation, and disengagement are important challenges that must be addressed through dialogue as a measure of conflict prevention, particularly in the Himalayas. I completely agree that anti-terrorism and anti-piracy could be areas for cooperation and that accident prevention is crucial. Now, in that context, what comes to mind is the events in Galwan, in the Galwan Valley of Ladakh, along the India-China line of actual control in the June of 2020. How do we prevent such incidents and such events and such confrontation from happening in future? I think that is something that should really occupy our concern, particularly India and China, as two important Asian nations who can afford to act with far more maturity and restraint. I'm not here to apportion blame at all, please understand. As far as trade is concerned, I completely agree that even as we talk of self-reliance or dual circulation, diversifying sources of supply, becoming less dependent on foreign aid or assistance, can all contribute to self-reliance, and we obviously cannot afford dependence on single sources of supply. We need resilient supply chains. Another phrase that struck me while reading the report was the need for robust multipolarity as a key for the Indo-Pacific region. Multipolarity really expresses both the geography of the region, but also its essential identity. It is meant to be multipolar. That is how history and geography and past interactions in the region have provided us in terms of understanding. We need stability and predictability, definitely, when it comes to difficult relations such as ours. Although I would not agree with what one of the Chinese contributors to the report mentioned. As I read it, this is what struck me. India, he or she, I'm not sure of the identity, the observer, the Chinese analyst said that India is a straw counterbalance to China in the context of what US and India are doing today. I believe that India is much more than a straw counterbalance to China, and I believe that term would be a misnomer. But let me come back to the need for crisis prevention and management and strategic communication to prevent a crisis from developing. You spoke of hotlines and more connectivity being established in order to handle crises and prevent them. And I can't underestimate the importance of that. I'm afraid the persistent assessment, as the Indian contributors to the report said, is that in India, the persistent impression is that China is unhappy with India's rise, just as the Chinese feel that the United States may be unhappy with China's rise. But we have to manage change. And as the key observation in the report mentions, there are three colliding sets of objectives. China seeking to recover what it sees as its centrality. Others may disagree with that. The Asian countries, including India, seek to preserve their autonomy. And the US, and I'm sure that Indian aims coincide with that, would like to create robust multipolarity in Asia. I wouldn't like to use terms like domination or hegemony in this context. I think we have to look at these issues in a very clinical, objective and non-subjective way. But the fact is that the intersection of these objectives has created strategic mistrust, as the report has mentioned. Now, one question that troubled me as I read the report was an issue raised by one of the Chinese contributors to the report, that China might try to use its powerful economic relationships to prevent Asian countries from maintaining security relationships with the US. Now, perhaps that needs to be elaborated further. We need a little more reassurance on that front. But it's so important for us, as we have done in this case, to maintain and to develop regular channels, as we have done, for exchange of views with maturity and restraint and continuity, because who the participants are, as you mentioned, is going to be vital. And security, economics, and long-term issues should all find a home, in some form of dialogue. But let me say, when it comes to India and China, the events of last year have deeply altered the atmosphere of relations between the two countries. And the levels of mistrust at this moment have reached a high point and never seen before in the last few decades of the relationship between the two countries. And China's role in India's neighborhood, particularly in South Asia, has also heightened apprehensions in India about what our observers see as Chinese encirclement of India. And these are all matters I think we need to sort out through consistent and regular dialogue at a suitably high level, not just at track 2 level between the two countries. This level of mistrust does not contribute to an atmosphere where we do not want tensions between the two countries. And like the report mentions, the avoidance of conflict and accidental conflict particularly perhaps is the threat that stares us in the face, I think has to be addressed, and we must find means to reduce the potential and the possibility of that. Now, the heightened rivalry between China and the United States also cannot be conducive to regional stability. I've drawn myself a little back while saying this. When you think of economic progress, the peaceful settlement of disputes, tensions of the sort that we see between China and the United States also do not contribute to regional stability. As I said before, the region is made for multipolarity and not for binary confrontations, either between the US and China or between India and China. So the other thing was the Chinese views on the Quad, and they are seeing the Quad as contributing to a threat that China faces. I believe that what the Quad is doing today in terms of energizing cooperation in health and cybersecurity and critical and enabling technologies, climate, information exchange, apart from the trilateral and bilateral initiatives that tie India with countries like Japan and the United States and Australia, really cannot add up to a threat to China. Let me say also that the steps that China has taken in the region and certain attitudes as expressed by China in the region have, in a sense, promoted moves by India to seek closer ties with the United States. That is a given, and with long-term partners like Japan particularly. Another issue perhaps we have not been able to address in the report is the whole China-Russia partnership today and what it means for the questions of stability in our region, and how and whether this will be an occasion or a source for further instability in the Indo-Pacific. That factor has not been perhaps studied. It really perhaps would not have come up because this is a trilateral discussion between India, China, and Russia. But if China talks about the Quad, maybe we should also India and the United States look at the China-Russia relationship. Mind you, with Russia, India has a time-tested partnership, which we have continued to nurture. But this relationship is also a salient feature in the regional scenario as we view it today. And to briefly address what Ambassador Weiwei said, I think the greatest internal challenge facing India today is not the issue of land ownership, but the management of diversity, accelerating economic development in order to lift more and more people out of poverty, promoting skill development, health security, particularly in a pandemic, livelihoods, climate change, gender equality. But let me add also for our Chinese friends that Indian democracy has shown its stability, resilience, and vitality. Of that, there is no question. Never underestimate, I tell my Chinese friends, the enormous strides made by India over the last few decades, our rejuvenation, as it were. And this is an economy that bursts with potential, and there's already proof of that in so many sectors. And above all, please do remember, I say this to all our friends across the world, not just to China, we are a civilization state that is a leading democracy today. And I think each of us as countries has to develop a keener listening ear when it comes to our counterparts, enrich our knowledge of each other, remove prejudice and stereotypes. And above all, a commitment to dialogue must remain supreme, as also conflict prevention and the management of change. We cannot sustain armed coexistence indefinitely. All three of us must realize that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ralph, for your very comprehensive remarks. You also provide, I think, a very careful assessment of the report, and you emphasize the importance of managing the strategic mistrust among the three countries, and also you call for the robust multipolarity in the region. And toward the end, you also call for renewed commitment to dialogue. I think, I'm sure certainly this point will be well received by all the participants. Thank you so much. Next, last but not the least, it is my honor to invite a leading China hand, our dear Professor David Mike Lambton, the former director of China program at Johns Hopkins, to give remarks. Mike, please.
Well, thank you, Wang Dong, and it's I admire the project that's been undertaken and the 4 webinars, and I appreciate very much the comments of my 2 preceding commentators. And I think I'll stick with my original remarks, but their remarks offer great food for thought and stimulated additional thoughts. I do want to thank Ambassador Schaefer for writing such a good summary report that leads in so many productive directions. And I want to thank the USCET and all of the staff for putting together and sponsoring and doing all the things that are necessary to make a project so successful. I think my most useful role at this point can be to raise some questions and observations that occurred to me as I read this very sprawling report that dealt with maritime security, global and regional governance, strategic mistrust, and geoeconomics. There's no set of 10-minute comments that can do justice to that agenda, but I do admire the breadth and comprehensive character of the report. I think I have 5 points I'd briefly want to make, and hopefully less than 2 minutes for each point, but hopefully it'll stimulate some discussion. Point 1, I was struck by the often recurring use of the word preventing war as our primary objective. And of course, I don't object to preventing war as our primary objective. But it did occur to me that we are talking about conflict with 3 nuclear powers, and we'll just forget Pakistan. So we are talking about a level of complexity and consequence of conflict that probably nobody has ever had any experience potentially dealing with. So when we can't be too cavalier about talking about war here, and I don't mean to suggest that I thought anybody was, but this is really an unparalleled circumstance. In that vein, it occurred to me, if you remember back to the conflict in 2000 and 2001 between India and Pakistan concerning Kashmir, and at least in the West, there was lots of talk about nuclear escalation between Pakistan and India. I'll leave it to experts to say how close we got or didn't get. But what I do have a strong recollection of is that the Chinese played a very important role in, let us say, talking seriously to Pakistan. And as I recall, Musharraf went to Beijing twice. Jiang Zemin played a very important role. And my question is, if a similar thing happened now, could we count on that degree of cooperation? So it seems to me the situation's gotten worse, but we can count on less cooperation than at least in the 2000, 2001. I'd appreciate some comments if you have any. What would happen 20 years later in a similar circumstance? Second thing that occurs to me is that, and it was mentioned in one of the commentators' remarks just a minute ago, is that how US-China relations play out will have great consequence for India. And I wouldn't attribute specific meaning to a preceding comment, but it seemed to me that India could get more nervous the more conflictual US-China relations become. And all I would say, and it's a development that's had its predecessor, was preceded by the publication of this report, but a particular development very recently is just what I would call the increasing deterioration of US-China relations over Taiwan. And of course, a conflict, a cross-strait conflict of any nature is going to involve all of Asia one way or another, whether it's maritime space, economic space, obviously military space. I must say, just speaking personally, I think it's a very important and I would say dangerous step for the US to start talking about changing the role of Taiwan in the strategic architecture of American policy, talking about it as a strategically critical area, critical node in the first island chain. This is all very, I would say, vocabulary and phraseology that is fraught with danger. And so I must say I'm alarmed by the drift of relations across the strait. I'd also obviously include Chinese military pressure and so on in my list of related worries. But in other words, I think I'd be interested in hearing how India looks at the deterioration, not only of US-China relations in general from its own interests, but the cross-strait situation. A third thing that came to me or occurred to me is every time somebody talked about recommendations, what do we do? The words climate change came up. But if I just look at what happened, not as an expert, but as an interested observer at COP26, I would say the US upped its game on climate change. But frankly, India and China are actually closer to each other in having concerns about dramatic commitments than either of them is close to the US. So I must say, actually quite disappointed at COP26. China stuck with its 2030 or earlier commitment on emissions, reaching peak emissions, but the US dropped considerably. And if I understood, and I'm glad to be corrected, India made no significant new commitments. Now, in all honesty, the one thing that I thought it was good that Su Jianhua and Kerry talked. I thought it was good we had a methane agreement of sorts. So I don't mean to say absolutely no progress, but this seems like an issue that's actually very difficult for these three to cooperate when you get down to it. So it seems much in fashion to talk about cooperating in climate change, but I'm not sure this trilateral group of countries is in a position to do so. Please correct me if I'm wrong on that. Another area that was briefly touched on, but which I think is very important, is BRI and connectivity in Southeast Asia and connectivity with China. Obviously, it seems to me the fact of the matter is, though, China's doing connectivity and the United States and India are talking about connectivity. And if you need any more sense of what I mean, just look at last week where the Laos high-speed rail opened up in Laos from Kunming. So I think if the US and India, don't want an economically oriented Asia completely, they've got to get into the infrastructure game. But I saw no significant proposals, nor do I see much indication that the US and our friends around the world are going to do too much, for the very good reason, perhaps, that we have other priorities and needs. But this whole issue of connectivity and Chinese centrality to connectivity is an important issue. And I would like to see all three countries coordinate and cooperate to a greater extent to build a more integrated, efficient, and equitable connectivity system. But I think that falls into the realm of hopes and dreams, not probably reality. And let me just conclude my remarks is, and I think Ambassador Rao mentioned, but certainly the report mentioned, every time I read the word robust multipolarity, I read those words, I kind of wondered what it really meant. It's one of those kind of useful phrases that maybe conveys a different idea to everybody else or to the different observers. But how is robust multipolarity different than balance of power? And then who's going to be the swing state in the balance of power? So it just seems to me we've got a fundamental strategic problem between these three countries. And I think Ambassador Rao mentioned it, and you please correct me, Ambassador, if I mischaracterized, but the report and the ambassador talked about, well, the US sticks with its basic objective of predominance or preeminence. We have a bunch of euphemisms, but the US would really prefer to stay dominant in the region. I say that as this American, maybe other Americans would disagree, but I think you could broadly say that's our underlying objective if we can sustain that. India, I think, is rather clear what it wants. It wants autonomy and development, but key being autonomy. And China wants restored centrality. Well, centrality to what? The region, the world? I think one of our commentators mentioned it's really an internal concept of, but China's centrality in history was always more than centrality to China itself. It had implications for the region. So I guess my underlying question is what really is robust multipolarity? And what are we seeking? What do we need to manage it? Anyway, thank you for such an interesting report. I hope my comments have at least stimulated reaction. Back to you, Wang-Dong.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Lampton. It's as usual, I think your insightful comments to the report. I'm sure it will generate a lot of discussion for the next session. Particularly, I think your very last question, I think, is particularly stimulating. So we are pushed to think hard about what robust multipolarity really means, and then boils down to U.S., China, India, what their respective goals is in that context. So now 3 speakers have given their remarks, and I think we are quite good at time management. That's a very good sign. We are about to have 20 minutes or so Q&A session. So all the participants who are in the meeting, you can use the function, raise hand function to ask question, and I'll be happy. Please identify yourself and also make clear which speaker you would like to direct your question to, or you can also simply make a remark, make a comment. That is fine too. Oh, I see. Okay, but I don't see any questions put it on the chat function. I didn't see any. Or maybe, let me say this, maybe begin with Professor Lambton's very last question. And I'm not sure if other speakers, Ambassador Wei and Ambassador Rao would be interested in, and Ambassador Schaffer as well, and maybe Julia as well, would be interested in taking that question.
Mendong, there are 3 questions.
Okay.
Question and answer. In the question and answer button.
Oh, I see. I now I see. Sorry.
Okay.
Traditional. What can 3 parties do to ensure Malacca does not become another one of many flashpoints? Very good question. So how to make sure the Strait of Malacca will not become another flashpoint? Any speaker would like to take this question?
Can I?
Oh, yes, please, Ambassador Rao. Yes, absolutely. Yes,
I thank you, Mr. Wang. I did read the question in the Q&A box, and so I gave it some thought. I think the question was, while India and China have this problem along their land borders, China's Malacca Strait dilemma should concern India also. And I think that is a point of relevance, because a lot of India's trade today moves through the South China Sea, much more than before. Just the quotient of trade and exports in India's overall economy is so much greater than it used to be before. So India is concerned about the maritime environment around the peninsula. As you know, the Indian peninsula juts out into the Indian Ocean, and India in many ways is as much a maritime nation as it is a subcontinental landmass that is concerned about what happens on its northern borders. So yes, I think the only way to alleviate tension in this regard is to have freedom of navigation in order to secure the sea lanes of communication, to deal with anti-terrorism, anti-piracy, peaceful settlement of disputes. I know that China and the ASEAN have been talking of codes of conduct for this particular part of neck of the woods, a particular part of the region, and for the last 25 years, and we have not seen much progress made on that front. As the report mentions, I think dialogue is the only way forward. The Indian Ocean and the South China Sea and the Western Pacific were all, zones of close interaction over history, both in terms of economy and in terms of the extent of Chinese and Indian soft power that reached into the region and influenced so much of the history of these nations. So when we talk of robust multipolarity, we needed to really take reference and understand the context in which this region has existed over centuries, and which is why the term robust multipolarity to me acquires resonance and needs to be explored, because binary confrontation, whether it's between India and China, two of the largest Asian nations, and also binary confrontation between the United States and China, can do very little good for the region, which is why we need multipolarity, which may, in my view, amount to more than a balance of power, but let me call it an equilibrium of power and interests and influence in the region.
Thank you, Ambassador Ra. Ambassador Wei, please.
这个问题呢，我想是这样，这个马六甲海峡呢，
About this question, the Malacca Strait is actually different from the border dispute from China and India. It's not a maritime border, it is an international sea lane between Malaysia and Indonesia. Of course, it is also through Singapore. This strait has to do with with China's interest, and also the whole Asia Pacific's peace and stability. It is actually choking point, has a strategic significance. If something happens in this area, the whole world wouldn't accept. All countries and the people hope that Malacca Strait is utilized peacefully and is smooth. So I believe that when there are problems with the Malacca Strait, China will have enough diplomatic capability and other capabilities to deal with such a dilemma, to ensure that this strait will be a peaceful international sea lane that everybody can have access to. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Wei. I also saw Professor Lambton has his hand up. Yes, please, Mike.
This is simplistic. I'm not a maritime international law expert, but it seems to me, precisely because the ASEAN states are not highly armed, they're packed close to around the region we're talking about, that all three powers basically ought to agree that ASEAN will, whatever level of regulation needed here, that they are the primary kind of responsible actor here. None of them have the capability to close it down themselves, and the rest of the three powers should delegate that responsibility and relax. I think this is one of the problems. You talk more about, the worse it gets. So I would say recognize ASEAN centrality, at least as a starting point. Now, of course, we all can imagine circumstances where everything breaks down, but our objective here is to avoid that circumstance. So I didn't hear in any of this answer ASEAN, which seems to me to be the starting point, Singapore, Indonesia in particular.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. I think next question, I assume it comes from a Chinese audience, since it was written in Mandarin. So but I can translate it into English here. The question says, when the United States criticize India, violate human rights, and criticize India of democratic regression, India Foreign Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar came to the defense of Indian democracy, and arguing that the West has monopolized what the definition of democracy and the criteria of democracy. Then his or her question, this audience question, is that why, when India, when it comes to discussion about the democracy in China, India kind of behave like the United States, as if it also enjoys the moral superiority, and then categorize China as a liberal state. Very interesting question. So Ambassador Rao, maybe you want to take it? Ambassador Raw, you have to unmute yourself.
Yes, sorry.
Yes.
Thank you for that question. I wanted to say that from time to time, yes, there have been exchanges between India and the United States. We are two large democracies. I don't think anybody can claim to be perfect. That's not the way the world was created. There are areas in which we can afford to improve, we need to improve, and we will improve. So this dialogue between democracies is an ongoing one, and I believe the channels of communication are open. And I don't believe it has detracted in any way from the strength and the resilience of the relationship that India and the United States enjoy. I'd like to say that. I say that from the perspective of somebody who is not in government anymore. I live far away from Delhi. There is a saying in Urdu, which is one of India's languages, called Dilli Dur Ast, which means Delhi is far away when I speak this. But I speak about this resilience and this maturity in our relationship, which I think we can afford, we can bear the load. The load bearing capacity of the relationship is quite good. Now, when it comes to China, I don't believe, outside China, and you have your own governance system and your people are entitled to it. We don't interfere in your choices and the decisions you make in that regard. We have an open and free and independent expression of opinion in our country. That's, as you know, that's the way democracies are born. That's the way they are made. That's the way they live. And we express our opinions on certain aspects of what may happen in China from time to time, particularly on areas that border India, especially. So that is something that you will have to understand will come from sections of Indian opinion from time to time. But by and large, I believe that the government of India has transacted its relations with China with a great deal of equanimity and with a sense of balance and always, I believe, with also a sense of restraint. So I'd like our Chinese friend who asked that question to also understand that. And if I may just interject a small point here, there was a debate about centrality, about China's centrality. And I'm going to talk in terms of geopolitics and how geography influences geopolitics. And you look at the map and you consider in the Indo-Pacific, which is really where the Indian and the Pacific Oceans meet, look at the centrality of India as in terms of how geography has ordained it. To the west of India, you have the opening to the Gulf and then further on into Europe. And to the east of India, across eastern China, India's eastern borders, look at Myanmar, look at the Malay Peninsula, look at the Andaman Sea, which then stretches into the Pacific Ocean, to the Straits of Malacca. So think of India also as one of the most central of nations.
Thank you, Ambassador Raw, for your answer to this question. Next, there is another, I'm not sure if I got the question correct, but the question goes like this: to apply the game theory to the three bodies, United States, India, and China, which scenarios would our panelists predict? 3 wins, or 2 wins, 1 lose, or 1 win, 2 losers, or 3 losers? So perhaps I think the question goes like, is there any possibility of like, we call the all 3 wins, win, or there has to be some zero-sumness goes into this relationship? I'm trying to maybe reinterpret this question in a slightly different way. So any speakers would like to take this question? Okay, Ambassador Wei, please.
这个问题啊，我是没有想到会提出这个问题，但是我很愿意回答这个问题。我觉得这里
I didn't realize that there could be such a question, but I would like to say something on it. When we look at the three countries, I don't think it has to be any of the scenarios, 3 wins, 3 losses, or 2 win, 1 loss, 2 loss, 1 win. I think it depends on different times. I think the three countries are in a dynamic relationship, and it's dynamic and balanced. Maybe in a certain period of time, 2 countries may get closer, while in a different time, the other 2 countries can get closer. And so it's a dynamic relationship rather than a win or loss situation. I don't think there will be 3 wins or 3 losses, and it's a more 3 party dynamic balance.
Thank you, Ambassador Wei, for taking the question. I think there's another question. It's actually for me. I can read. I can share it with the panel. How should we maximize using trilateral economic and trade links among China, India, and the United States, given the overall massive market share, to mitigate political or security disagreement among each country? So how can use trilateral economic trade links to mitigate political and security disagreement?
Well, go ahead.
Oh,
I have the most modest contribution, so I'll just sneak it in and let the ambassador ask the better question. I guess on economic relations, I would say the U.S. has a major responsibility here. Clearly, I'm not speaking for our government, but I think this tariff process that we initiated is really deleterious. And I think it's not good for China either. China has many trade barriers that function like tariffs. But I think we ought to get back on the track of that phase 1 trade agreement. We ought to undo tariffs, and we ought to work, because frankly speaking, I think economics is the most powerful cohesive force all 3 of our countries have. And so I would say, let's get rid of as many of these tariffs as possible, as many trade barriers. We had a good discussion going on with the phase 1 trade deal. Let's get back on that track.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Ambassador Raw?
Well, I think the stakes are very high here, and I think economics is at the core of all that we do today to improve the lives of our people and peoples, as also, the free flow of technology and ideas. Technology has come to dominate our lives today in so many ways. It's changing the way we do business, it's changing our lifestyles, changing the way we look at the rest of the world. And the pandemic particularly has changed all that. And unfortunately for India and China, the pandemic coincided with the sharp descent and deterioration in our relations post-Galwan. And the climate in India today, the mood as far as public and political opinion is concerned, is extremely fraught, is extremely disturbed about the state of India-China relations, and what we see as deterioration in relations that was really not expected. Nobody expected all this to happen on the border. And the fallout of that has been, there are views being expressed in India that we need to decouple from China in terms of trade and economic terms. I know that's easier said than done. That is not going to happen so quickly, but the China-India economic relationship, China, is our largest trading partner in goods. And similarly, the United States is our largest trading partner in goods and services. So both these relations are extremely important to us. And how we transact them and how we deliberate on the way forward is going to affect the lives of our people. So whatever steps we take in this regard have to be taken with a lot of deliberation. We can't rush in, where angels fear to tread, literally.
Thank you, Ambassador Raw. I would like to, I think I saw hands from Julia and Ambassador Wei as well. So I would like to give last words to Ambassador Block and then Ambassador Wei. Julia, you still here?
Yes, I lowered my hand because I have a question.
Oh,
I'm not
okay.
answering the question. So if Ambassador Wei is going to respond to the question, then let him go first.
Okay. Ambassador Wei, please.
Economic and trade relations is the fundamental relation among different countries, but it is not the highest level of national interest. Security is the priority for any country in terms of its national interest. Economic interest is not the most important interest of any country, but economic and trade relations can be used to deal with the relations between different countries. And so if we look at China and India, yes, the relationship is deteriorating. However, the trade between China and India has increased dramatically. This has to do probably with the pandemic. China is able to maintain stable manufacturing and production during the time of the pandemic. Now there has been a lot of tension between many countries in terms of their relationship. And so this deterioration of China-India relation is not that worrying, I guess. I think the leaders of two countries have their bottom lines to observe when it comes to the relation between the two countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Wei. So Julia, you want to go first and then Tezzy?
Sure.
Okay.
Unless Tezzy, your question relates to the economic issue.
Okay. So go ahead, Julia. No,
okay.
No, it's not.
My question is really about next steps. And Ambassador Rao actually started us thinking. Obviously, we can conclude that Indo-Pacific security cooperation is bigger than just US, China, and India. Ambassador Rao mentioned Japan and Russia. And Pakistan came up. And then, of course, Mike Lampton talked about ASEAN. So how do we proceed? Shall we proceed? What in our speakers' minds would be the most important next steps? What countries, in addition, should be brought into this equation and discussion?
All right. So Ambassador Chang just raised this question, and the speakers would like to briefly comment on.
Well, I think as Ambassador Lampton said, the centrality of ASEAN should never be ignored. And I think the ASEAN countries, the 10 Southeast Asian nations, lie at the core of this region. They are the beating heart of this region. And I think even as we deliberate on the way forward and what roles we must all play to reduce tension, I think the voices of the ASEAN must be heard. And by and large, the impression I get from the ASEAN countries is that they want a reduction of tension. They want no part in conflict. They really don't want to take sides. And they're the truly non-aligned in all this. So let us hear their voices and let us be sensitive to the signals coming out of that region.
Thank you. Ambassador Roth. I would like to give last words to Ambassador Schaffer. Tessie, please.
I'm not sure this is what you had in mind by way of last words, but I have 2 points to make. First of all, Professor Lampton asked whether in a fresh India-Pakistan crisis, one could count on a Chinese role in de-escalating it. I'm not sure whether he was talking about the same crisis as the one I remember, which was in 1999, when Indian and Pakistani forces were engaged in the high Himalayas, and Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif went to Beijing and came home after 1.5 days of what was supposed to be a 6-day visit. It was clear that they had had a very cordial visit, but that the message was, we don't really like what's going on between you and India. So my answer to his question is, at that time, China considered it not in its interest for India and Pakistan to actually go to war. So the answer to that question depends on China's reading of its own interests. But let me then conclude with more of a concluding type statement that as so often happens, the energizing part of this session has come in the Q&A. So may I offer my thanks to our lively audience who has given us all things to think about, which never made it into our earlier webinars. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Schaffer. So that will be a very nice conclusion from words from Ambassador Schaffer. And I would like to, it's my honor to invite Professor and former Dean of School of International Studies at Peking University, who is also Director of the Institute for Global Cooperation and Understanding at the Peking University, Professor Jia Qingguo, to deliver a concluding remarks. Ambassador Jia. Professor Jia, please.
Okay, thank you. Professor Wang Dong. I want to thank Ambassador Teresa Schaffer for briefing the report, and also Ambassador Wei Wei, Ambassador Rao, and Professor Mike Lampton for delivering their great speeches. This is the concluding session we have in this series of dialogue. I think participants from 3 countries came to the dialogue with goodwill and seriousness. They have patiently explained the respective perspectives of their countries, as the report detailed, and they have carefully listened to each other, and they have actively and also respectively engaged in exchange of opinions. As a result, we all get a better sense of each other's views and perspectives, and a more objective assessment of what is going on in the relations between our 3 countries. And on that basis, we all agree that our 3 countries need more dialogue, need to take measures to prevent accident-induced military conflicts, to engage in cooperation when our interests overlap, and in general, do whatever necessary so that we can continue to enjoy peace, stability, and prosperity in a time of great uncertainties. I think our efforts are worthwhile and productive, and we are doing a great service to our 3 countries in managing the complexity and difficulty of the relations. My institute, the Institute of Global Understanding and Cooperation, has been privileged to work with the US-China Education Trust to co-host this trilateral dialogue. A year has passed since we started the dialogue, Many things have happened since. Among them, we find continuous spread of the pandemic, the change in the US government, fluctuations in the world's economy, and so on and so forth. One thing that's particularly concerning is the continued deterioration of relations between China and the US. So much so that one finds that the US Congress has been busy with hundreds of proposed legislations on China as if it were a Chinese Congress. Just joking. In a recent comment, Professor Wang Dong argued that China-US relationship is worse than any time since the 1970s. His view is shared by many. What is going on with China-US relations? How, now that Trump is gone and Biden's in, should the relationship be better? That's what people expected when Biden came in. The reality, however, is just the opposite. Conflicts have continued, cooperation has not increased that much, and confrontation has increased, even to the extent that we are more and more worried about a war somewhere. How do we explain this current situation then? Personally, I think the following things may be directly responsible. First, we have spent too much time focusing on each other's problems, and worse than that, exaggerate these problems. To the Americans, China means human rights violation, territorial assertiveness, and pushing back on the US influence. To the Chinese, the US stands for drug abuse, domestic violence, international warmongering, and containment of China. Second, we have spent too little time appreciating each other's achievement and good efforts. To China, the US has ignored the fact that China has contained the pandemic very effectively and helped other countries to fight the pandemic, and has maintained economic growth, and has promoted international efforts to deal with the climate change, and has eliminated absolute poverty, among other things. To the Chinese, they ignore the fact the US have made a lot of good efforts to fight the pandemic, to help other countries to fight the pandemic, to defend the rights of the ethnic minorities, to promote international cooperation to deal with climate change and other things. Thirdly, many on both sides have gauged each other's intentions from a too negative and self-centered perspective. To the Chinese, everything the US done is about containing China. And to the Americans, everything China does is to challenge the US predominance and exclude the US from the region. Fourthly, we have spent too much time and energy to find ways to confront each other. The US has been thinking about how to stop the growth of China's influence. Whatever China does, whether China tries to push to help other countries in their efforts to fight the pandemic, it represents a growth of China's influence that has to be stopped or undermined. And how to stop China's efforts to deter Taiwan separatism. And the Democracy Summit, that's part of the reason, is bundled into this effort. To the Chinese, how to stand up against the US. That's a primary concern. And then, of course, on the Democracy Summit, you see very strong reactions and condemnation of this summit. Fifthly, we have spent too little energy and efforts to study how we can cooperate and work with each other. We have a lot of things in, common interests, but we seem to don't have much time to work together on those things, such as promoting international cooperation to fight the pandemic, to work together to revive the world's economic growth, and to defend the international order in a broad sense. And finally, we have given too little respect to each other's core concerns. The US has largely ignored China's concern about Taiwan now. It's actually being very provocative from the Chinese perspective. Chinese appear to have been ignoring the US core concern about access to the region. In some aspects, so we have a lot of problems. And these, in some aspects, I think these problems also apply to China-India relations, such as how we see each other and gauge each other's intentions. I think it's time to change all this before it is too late. We do not want war to get us. We do not want war to get us by accident. We do not want our people to become enemies. We do not want to squander our valuable resources confronting each other instead of putting them into better use. We do not want to let another Trump administration to handle our relations. I think leaders of our three countries should listen more to their experts and exercise their wisdom and will to take a more pragmatic approach in managing the differences and promote mutual understanding and cooperation. This should not, I understand, should not be the end of our cooperation, Julia. Let's continue, think about for next steps. Finally, I want to take this opportunity to thank Ambassador Julia Block, a longtime friend, for her dynamic and enlightened leadership. I also want to thank Professor Wang Dong for doing most of the coordination and organization on the Chinese side. And I want to thank all the distinguished participants who have participated in this dialogue and contributed tremendously. And I wish to take this opportunity to thank the great staff of our two institutions whose dedication and hard work has made this dialogue possible, smooth, and successful. Thank you all. Thank you very much.